You are listening to Aftersight. This recording is intended solely for individuals who are blind or have low vision.
Thank you for joining us for the Colorado Sun, read by Liz. This is being recorded on Friday, September 6th, 2024. Today, we will be reading the following main articles. Is racism fueling claims about a Venezuelan gang, quote, takeover, end quote, of apartment buildings in Aurora? By Jennifer Brown. Sarah and Charles summited all 58 of Colorado's tallest peaks. They wanted their adult son to reach the top of just one. By Dan England. And 3 Colorado utilities are getting $1.1 billion from the feds to accelerate the move to renewable energy, by Mark Jaffe. And then we'll be following up with a few miscellaneous articles. In immigration news, is racism fueling claims about a Venezuelan gang, quote, takeover, end quote, of apartment buildings in Aurora? Anti-immigration backlash is nothing new, says sociology and criminology experts who point to attacks against the Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants about 100 years ago, by Jennifer Brown. The profanity-filled text message called them, quote, animals, end quote, and warned them to, quote, be ready, end quote, for a militia gearing up to fight because, quote, everyone who hates illegals know where you live, end quote. Gerson, a Venezuelan who came to Colorado in December, had been selling empanadas, arepas, and Gatorade to people living in his apartment complex as they finished their workday. And he had included his phone number on the green poster board menu that he hung in his apartment window. A photo of the menu, including his phone number, ended up on X with the author of the post saying, quote, Venezuelan gangs open restaurant, end quote. Then came the text, quote, I hope you know the Colorado veterans are building a militia with more firepower than you guys could ever imagine, end quote. It wasn't the only vulgar anti-immigration message that Gerson, who doesn't want his full name used because he fears for his life, has received in the past week, as conservative local elected officials and media across the world have warned that a Venezuelan gang has, quote, taken over, end quote, 3 apartment complexes in Aurora. Unknown intruders have hung signs in the hallways of one of the buildings calling it time to take back the city. A local gang graffitied the walls with their signs. Tenants say a vehicle drove by as its occupants held up guns and shouted, quote, F Venezuelans, end quote. And there were rumors for days that the Hells Angels were coming on their motorcycles to attack the residents until the Hells Angels released a statement saying they were in fact not getting involved. At this point, tenants interviewed by the Colorado Sun say they are more scared of white supremacists and people with animosity towards immigrants than they ever were of a Venezuelan gang. Residents more concerned about rodents, bed bugs, and leaky ceilings. The anti-immigration backlash and the tendency to equate newcomers to the United States with criminality is nothing new, says sociology and criminology experts, who point out that it's been happening since the first waves of Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants more than 100 years ago. This is despite the fact that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than people who were born in this country, according to decades of research. The pending presidential election, when immigration is among the most contentious issues in the nation, and after more than 40,000 South American migrants have come through Denver alone in the past year and a half, brings even more hysteria to the situation, the experts said. Anti-immigration sentiment and xenophobia aimed at Venezuelans has escalated rapidly since the property management company running the 3 apartment complexes blamed their dilapidated condition on a, quote, takeover, end quote, by the infamous gang Tren de Aragua, saying their property manager was too afraid to collect rent. A Fox News video showing armed men outside an apartment door fueled the fire. Aurora City Councilwoman Danielle Jurinsky blamed, quote, failed border policies, end quote, and helped a few residents move out of one of the apartments. Then social media exploded with unfounded, politically charged accusations, including that gang members were looting the local Target. Aurora police said they have identified 10 people linked to the Tren de Aragua gang, including 6 in custody. There have been no arrests related to extorting rent from residents of the apartment complexes, though 2 brothers who are gang members were arrested in connection with a shooting near one of the apartments this summer. Aurora Police Chief Heather Morris said the apartments had not been taken over by any gang, contradicting the mayor and other city officials. There are 36 known gangs operating in Aurora, according to a 2023 report. Tenants of 3 apartment complexes, including one condemned and cleared out by the city last month, say they were already worried about the rats, bedbugs, cockroaches, leaky ceilings, mold, and exposed wires in their apartments. Now they are the target of racism on a level they had not experienced since coming to this country. Quote, it's 110% involved racism, end quote. Jerson, 30, has stopped selling food from his apartment because of the threats. He's been assembling furniture to help earn the $1,200 in monthly rent for the apartment he shares with his uncles and 2 cousins. Jerson said he's been looking for more work, but potential employers have turned him away when they find out he is Venezuelan. Quote, I don't even feel safe, end quote, Jerson said in Spanish, describing how a local Mexican gang came to the apartments this week offering to sell him guns. Quote, and every day people are coming here to record with their phones, like this was a zoo or something. You feel like you're exposed, end quote. Most of the 1,500 people in the 3 apartment complexes are immigrants, including families from Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, and Puerto Rico, said V. Reeves, an advocate with House Keys Action Network in Denver. Quote, all of these families with children, they're working. They're going to be crucified and end up on the streets, end quote, Reeves said. The living conditions in the apartments, including lack of trash pickup, mold, and broken appliances, have been bad for years. So when the property management company distributed a news release blaming a Venezuelan gang for the issues, Reeves was shocked. Quote, it was a pretty disgusting press release, and it was very offensive and untrue, end quote, Reeves said. Quote, the statement was an incredibly racist one, end quote. Now people who have had to leave the condemned building last month are struggling to find housing, and residents of the other 2 complexes are worried about where they will live if their buildings are also shut down. Quote, no one is accepting them because they are seeing their address and saying they are from the gang apartments, end quote, Reeves said. Quote, they're worried about finding jobs. Children are having nightmares, end quote. Meanwhile, some city officials sided with the landlord and, quote, blamed an ethnicity group, end quote. Reeves said, quote, "It's gross," end quote, Reeves said. Nadine Ibrahim, who is the organizing director for the East Colfax Community Collective and has been helping people in East Denver and Aurora find housing, said the way the Venezuelan gang story blew up across the internet, quote, 110% involved racism, end quote. Tenants believe the public now thinks they are associated with criminal activity and that their apartment buildings are so dangerous that, quote, people shouldn't even go there without a police escort, end quote, Ibrahim said. Quote, when people are talking about organizing and what action they needed to take, they kept repeating the phrase, "We want to clear our name," Ibrahim said. Quote, these families support each other. No one is afraid of anyone else. They are taking care of each other's children, end quote. The way she sees it, the New York-based property management company CBZ Management made the Venezuelans the scapegoat. Quote, all this rhetoric has been another out for the landlord, end quote, she said. Quote, this story caught national attention with the focus on the Venezuelan gang rather than the slumlord, end quote. Quote, exploited for political gain, end quote. CBZ Property Management did not return a request for comment through its attorney, but in a June 28th letter to the Colorado Attorney General's office, the property management company said that the three complexes, Whispering Pines, Aspen Grove Apartments, and Edge of Lowry, had been, quote, forcibly taken control of by gangs that have immigrated here from Venezuela, end quote. The property manager, the attorney wrote, had, quote, taken refuge, end quote, because he was, quote, concerned for his life, end quote, and the company had complained to the Aurora Police Department and requested to meet with Aurora Mayor Mike Kaufman. Kaufman told Fox News last week that the apartments, quote, had fallen to these Venezuelan gangs, end quote, and that they have, quote, kind of pushed out the property management through intimidation and then collected the rents, end quote. The mayor said it differently Thursday when he told The Sun that he does, quote, not believe that a gang is in control of the apartment complexes and is forcibly collecting rent from the tenants, end quote. Quote, I'm concerned that the situation, although serious, has been exploited for political gain, end quote, Kaufman said via email after spending time at the apartments talking to tenants this week. Quote, I fully understand that there is a problem at the properties associated with a cultural pattern that whenever there is a concentration of Venezuelan migrants, that there is often a Venezuelan criminal element that follows to exploit them, end quote. Instead, Kaufman said, it seems the tenants stopped paying rent after property managers left the premises and no longer offered services. Tenants at one complex near Helena Street told The Sun on Thursday that trash service had stopped and no one was responding to requests to fix a leaky ceiling or mold growing behind the refrigerator. At another complex on Dallas Street, the lowest floor was covered with about 2 inches of water from Wednesday night's storm. Quote, hordes, end quote, quote, takeover, end quote, and, quote, overrun, end quote, used throughout history. Even former President Donald Trump is talking about what's happening in Aurora. Quote, take a look at Aurora in Colorado, where Venezuelans are taking over the whole town. They're taking over buildings, the whole town, end quote, Trump said during a Fox News town hall Wednesday night. Quote, you saw it the other day. They're knocking down doors and occupying apartments of people, end quote. The, quote, perceived threats of immigrant newcomers and this sense that they are prone to criminality is not new, end quote, said Lisa Martinez, a sociology and criminology professor at the University of Denver. Quote, that's always been the case with new arrivals. It's also not surprising with the lead up to the presidential election, end quote. Martinez watched the hysteria play out close to home after a post on Nextdoor from a neighbor who was scared about the Venezuelan gang and, quote, using the language of fear and xenophobia, end quote, or dislike of people from other countries. Quote, there were some neighbors who pushed back against it, end quote, she said. The story of the gang aligns with long-standing tropes that dehumanize immigrants, she said. Quote, it's almost easier to dehumanize people, and one of the ways to do that is to say that they're criminals, end quote, Martinez said. In the 1920s, after significant immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, Congress set up commissions to study the, quote, immigrant crime problem, end quote, said Prathipan Gulasekaram, a professor of constitutional and immigration law at the University of Colorado. A 1926 report could not substantiate any link between immigration and crime, and numerous subsequent studies also failed to find a correlation, said Gulasekaram, who has spent the past 4 months studying the subject. Quote, we have endemic public policy concerns that exist in the United States, end quote, Gulasekaram said. Quote, when you have racially distinct national origin group of people, it seems like the easiest thing to do is to blame the endemic public policy problem on that group. It has an innate appeal to people, but the problems existed before and will exist after, end quote. Throughout history, when the U.S. is concerned about immigration, politicians and the media use the same sensationalistic language. Hordes of immigrants, a takeover, being overrun, Gulasekaram said. Quote, it's a worn story, end quote, and it's, quote, evergreen, end quote, he said. In the early 1840s, Irish immigrants fleeing famine were depicted in editorial cartoons as subhuman. Later, Chinese immigrants coming to San Francisco, Oregon, and Washington were accused of corrupting the morals of white women. And Mexican immigrants smoked marijuana, according to the well-worn trope. Quote, we came here because of a dream, end quote. The apartment Francie Rodriguez and Anthony Bravo moved into in January has no working shower, black mold behind the refrigerator, and no heat. Gaps around the broken air conditioning unit in the wall made their apartment especially cold, so the family slept huddled around a space heater. With no maintenance or trash service for weeks at the complex on Helena Street, the residents have started putting all of their garbage together and taking turns hauling it away. Their apartment, which they share with 7 cats and kittens they rescued as strays, has exposed wires, electrical outlets that shoot sparks, and water leaks. They were paying $1,800 per month until the property management left and said they have received no assistance from the city of Denver or nonprofits that have helped thousands of migrants with a few months' rent. The couple's 2 daughters go to high school and middle school in Aurora. Brabo and Rodriguez, who operated a restaurant while living in Peru, used to sell homemade food in Aurora but stopped after they said someone falsely reported that they were selling drugs and alcohol. Brabo occasionally finds work while waiting outside a Home Depot. When they moved in, Brabo painted and did other maintenance in the apartment complex in what he thought was an exchange for decreased rent. But he did not get a break on the rent, he said. He also was not reimbursed for the supplies he used to repair holes in their apartment walls or the door he bought for the bathroom because it didn't have one. It's been a struggle since they arrived in Colorado 9 months ago. It's gotten even harder over the past week, they said. Quote, "We've been through so much to get here, and other people are judging us all," end quote. Rodriguez said, quote, "That's what everyone's worried about. We came here because of a dream, for a dream, a new life. And because of xenophobia, everyone treats us like this," end quote. Brabo said his biggest concern now are people who hate Venezuelans, who blame them for the actions of a few bad people. Neighbors in the complex help to take care of each other, he said, because that's what it's like in their South American culture. Quote, "We know each other here and we don't fight," end quote, Brabo said. Quote, "We don't do harm to anyone so that no one does us harm," end quote. By Jennifer Brown. In news of the outdoors, Sarah and Charles summited all 58 of Colorado's tallest peaks. They wanted their adult son to reach the top of just one. Reed Small, who has spina bifida, summited Pikes Peak with a special hiking chair and the help of nearly 75 volunteers. By Dan England. Whenever Sarah Thinger would hike a 14er with her husband Charles, one thought would stay with her, even after the Colorado Springs couple finished all 58 of the state's highest peaks. How could we get Reed up here? Reed Small is her son from a previous marriage, and by far the most adventurous out of her 3 kids. One, Sarah said, prefers to hide in her tent, complain about the mosquitoes, and read a book. Reed was an Eagle Scout, but Reed has spina bifida and uses a wheelchair, and his ability to enjoy the outdoors is limited. It's unfair, Sarah said, given how much Reed loves it outside. Quote, "It drives me nuts," end quote, Sarah said. Quote, "I feel like we could have more accessibility in nature. Our conversations with Reed when we are disconnected from the world are my favorite times," end quote. Reed loves camping and traveling and skiing and snowmobiling and kayaking. He went whale watching in Alaska. He's done zip lining. He's willing, Sarah said, to try anything. But hiking with Reed is nearly impossible. Wheelchairs don't come with 4-wheel drive, and pushing his rig over the inevitable rocks, roots, and the ups and downs would be like taking a Toyota Camry 4-wheeling in Ouray. They are stubborn, Sarah said, and make things happen, but Reed rarely gets to venture beyond a trailhead. And yet that's essentially what the Lockwood Foundation took on the weekend of August 24th when the nonprofit helped Reed to summit Pikes Peak. No, the organization didn't drive him up or even cheat a little by pushing him up the paved road. Dozens of volunteers took him from the parking lot to the top via the Bar Trail. Sure, Sarah and Charles could drive Reed there, but the thought of that was blasphemous. They met at church, and their first date was the remote 14er San Luis in 2011, when their friends ditched them and they hiked to the top together. They played co-ed softball together and found a spark in a mutual love for the mountains. They got married a year later. Reed was 7. Charles graciously redid 20 of the 14ers with Sarah, and they finished in 2019. Quote, "Do you realize the point of hiking?" End quote, Sarah said. Let me make a correction there. Quote, "Do you not realize the point of hiking?" End quote, Sarah said. Quote, "It's about the experience. It's not just being on the summit. It's the struggle and then the reward." End quote. Lockwood's mission is to expose people such as Reed to the outdoors, and taking wheelchair users up 14ers is part of that. But they've never done Pikes Peak before. Relative to other 14ers, Pikes Peak is gentle. The bar trail winds all the way to the top, and its path is smooth enough that there's a marathon on it every year. But it's also one of the longest and most arduous trips up. It's a half a marathon to the top with 8,000 feet elevation gain. Many 14ers don't require half that elevation to reach their tops. Pikes Peak, though, was a romantic choice for Sarah and Charles. They look at it every day, the backdrop to life in Colorado Springs. Pikes was the first 14er Charles climbed in 1999 after moving to the Springs. Charles and Sarah were married on the summit, riding the Cog Railroad to the top before saying their vows. More than once, the thought of getting Reed up there had crossed their minds. Wouldn't it be great if Reed's first 14er could be Pikes? The trail less traveled. Jeffrey Lockwood was a mountain guide with a background in caregiving who planned to go to law school. He saw a different path on Mount Blue Sky with Zara Vargas. Lockwood, who's worked as a caregiver since 2012, had Vargas as a client. She has cerebral palsy, meaning her mind was as sharp as anyone's, but her body wouldn't cooperate. And over breakfast, while he fed her, she would ask to see videos of him climbing mountains. One day, she said she wished she could do that. Lockwood drove her up Mount Blue Sky to the end of the paved path road, and with the help of a friend, carried her chair up the final few hundred feet on the trail to the summit. It nearly killed him, but Vargas's smile wiped the pain away. It was a career-changing moment. That's what he wanted to do. Vargas just so happened to have experience with nonprofits for those with disabilities as the executive director of Ms. Wheelchair Colorado. She even had a degree in nonprofit studies. She became an early champion of Lockwood's idea, and when he founded it in 2018, she became the first board member. As magical as that moment was on Mount Blue Sky, Lockwood knew it was sort of cheap, too. No 14er finishers with any ethics would count it as an actual climbing the mountain. He wanted to get Vargas up a 14er the proper way. He asked adaptive recreation leaders, who all said it would be too hard. He found a trail rider chair that could handle a trail but had to be human-powered. Lockwood found poetry in that. He spent his first year raising money through events, 4x4 adventures, and finding ways for those with disabilities to enjoy hiking. The nonprofit bought its first share in 2019. That same year, they tried to summit Quandary, a steep but gentle peak with a trail all the way. They made it just 200 feet below the summit when the weather turned iffy, and they made the painful decision to turn around. Lockwood said it was a conservative decision. An able-bodied person probably could have run to the top, tagged it, and gotten down in plenty of time. But if Vargas had been soaked, hailed on, or even killed, it not only would have devastated Lockwood, it would have devastated any chances of anyone else in a chair to get on the summit. Quote, "We didn't want to give the impression that wheelchair users shouldn't be on a mountain," end quote, Lockwood said. A year later, Lockwood and a host of volunteers got Vargas to the summit of Mount Elbert. She became, they think, the first wheelchair user to reach the top of Colorado's tallest mountain. She cried, and so did everyone else. The next year, in 2021, they brought up another wheelchair user. Since then, they have brought at least one wheelchair user up a 14er, including Chris Lane, a nurse and board member, in 2023. They have also brought 4 others up a 12,000-foot mountain and one 13er, and have helped dozens more go on hikes throughout Colorado. Lockwood calls the summit climbs, quote, "different than inclusion," end quote. Quote, "They feel like they belong on the mountain," end quote, Lockwood said. "It's passive participation, yes, but in the backcountry it's very normal to help someone," end quote, Lockwood said. Quote, "You might carry a backpack or a water bottle for someone. Others might show you the way up. That's just the mountains. The idea is that we are on this hike together. We don't feel like we are serving. We are climbing a mountain together," end quote. Halfway up Pikes Peak was just as hard. Even making it halfway to Bar Lake was a milestone for Reed. The trek was by far the most Reed's ever done on a trail. Bar Camp is 6.5 miles and nearly 4,000 feet of elevation gain, or the amount you'd spend hiking up many other 14ers. It takes 5 hours. The next day, on August 25th, nearly 75 people helped get Reed to the top. After they got married, when they could carry him, Sarah and Charles would backpack with Reed. But he's a 19-year-old man now. The trail rider has a single wheel with someone up front pulling, much like a mule with a plow. This is why the effort took so many people. It's hard enough to hike a 14er, especially as the air gets increasingly harder to breathe, even without carrying a chair with a person strapped in. Dozens needed to swap turns, huffing and puffing their way up. Staying at Bar Camp, though, is a luxury resort compared to any other 14er. They serve breakfast, provide small beds, and sell Skittles. The group left this relative paradise at 5:30 a.m. under headlamps. That morning, Lockwood went through a final plan, and he mentioned something about getting Reed to the top. Reed corrected him, quote, "Everyone needs to get to the top," end quote, Reed said, quote, "not just me." The Bar Trail is gentle in comparison to Long Peaks or many other 14ers, but it's still rocky, with tight sections that weave around boulders and through trees. Other hikers in the back help the chair work around the obstacles. Sarah watched the hikers strain to lift her son over a stray rock or boulder, and early on it brought tears to her eyes. Quote, "I started getting emotional as soon as we started," end quote, Sarah said. Quote, "just seeing the 40 or so volunteers, they didn't even know who they were helping, and it didn't matter," end quote. It was a relatively warm morning, which was nice, considering that Reed was exposed in the chair. He wore a down jacket at the start. He was a passenger, but it wasn't an easy trip for him. Contents may shift during hike. The trail flexed a little at the very end as it wound up the 16 golden stairs. Each, quote, stair, unquote, is a switchback, and the trail becomes more of a climb than a walk. Reed's abs began to ache from trying to stabilize himself as the hikers jostled him up and over the angry rocks. Quote, I don't remember the trail being that bad, end quote, Sarah said. Quote, but it's different when you take a chair up, end quote. Inspiration to bag another peak. The summit of Pikes is a busy place, with cars aggressively angling for parking spots and pedestrians hoping for a donut in the gift store. Hikers are uncommon and stand out, so it was a bit of a show when the train of hikers carrying a guy in a chair took their last steps to the summit. The gathering crowd cheered as they crested the top. It was such a different way to enjoy a mountain, both Sarah and Charles said, but it might be their favorite trip up one. Quote, it was such a community at the end quote, Sarah said. Quote, we were exchanging numbers, end quote. Lockwood said his foundation has more plans for bigger hikes next year. Mount Antero, with its long four-wheel drive road, is a possibility, he said. The organization has 4 chairs now and wants to use them up big peaks, not just hikes. He's hoping to continue to get more volunteers for the long weekends. Sarah, Charles, and Reed were inspired by the trip and have their own plans too. They are looking into buying a lighter version of the chair. They won't go up any 14ers by themselves, but now for the first time, they see the possibility of Reed enjoying the spaces that stretch beyond the trailhead. By Dan England. In business news, 3 Colorado utilities are getting $1.1 billion from the feds to accelerate the move to renewable energy. Tri-State received the largest Inflation Reduction Act award and says $679 million will help it exceed Colorado greenhouse gas reduction goals. By Mark Jaffe. 2 Colorado electric cooperatives and the Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association are in line for about $1.1 billion in grants and loans to speed the transition to renewable energy and soften the impact on rates. Tri-State, which provides wholesale power to 41 co-ops in 4 states, including 16 in Colorado, received the biggest award, $679 million. Brighton-based United Power, the second largest co-op in the state, received up to $261 million in funds. Core Electric Cooperative, the state's largest co-op, is set to get $225 million. The grants and loans are issued by the Federal Rural Utilities Service. The awards were part of a $7.3 billion in financing for 16 cooperatives and generation and transmission associations serving communities in 23 states through the Empower Rural America, or new ERA program, which is part of the Biden's administration Inflation Reduction Act. Quote, this is a big deal and transformational opportunity for Tri-State and other electric cooperatives across the country, end quote, Tri-State CEO Dwayne Hiley said. The total funding for the new ERA program is $9.7 billion. There were 160 requests for more than $44 billion. 16 applicants, including the 3 from Colorado, were chosen. Quote, "It just goes to show the pent-up demand out there," end quote. Andrew Burke, the administrator of the Rural Utilities Service, said in a briefing on Zoom on Thursday. The service is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Burke said that the new ERA program is the largest initiative the service has ever taken since it was created 90 years ago. Among the projects Tri-State will use the funds for are to help finance the closing of 1,100 megawatts of coal-fired power plants in Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, including 2 units in Craig. The new ERA grants and loans are tied to cooperatives achieving reductions in greenhouse gases, and Tri-State says with the funding it will cut Colorado greenhouse gas emissions by 89% over 2005 levels by 2030. The state requirement for utilities is an 80% reduction. The funding will also help the association to build or purchase 1,480 megawatts of solar and wind generation and battery storage across rural portions of Colorado, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Other Colorado initiatives include power purchase agreements with the Spanish Peaks Solar Initiative, 20 miles north of Trinidad in Las Animas County, and power purchase agreements for Western Slope Solar and Eastern Plains Wind. Tri-State will also build a 4-hour lithium-ion storage battery in eastern Colorado. Renewable generation projects planned for other states, too. The association is already well on the way to shifting to a renewable generation base under an electric resource plan pending final approval by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. The award would also help fund 13 projects in tri-state service areas in New Mexico, Wyoming, and Nebraska. The federal money could leverage as much as $2 billion in new investment. Quote, "This is the kind of money that creates real and lasting change, not just for Tri-State, but for the hundreds of rural communities it serves," end quote, said Eric Frankowski, executive director of the nonprofit Western Clean Energy Campaign. The federal funding will also help reduce the revenue required from the association's member co-ops by $422 million over 20 years, Tri-State said. Quote, "We serve some of the most economically disadvantaged communities in the West," end quote, Tri-State's Hiley said. Quote, "This significantly accelerates our transition. We build more renewables faster, and when we do that, the rates are lower," end quote. CORE is the largest co-op in the state, serving more than 375,000 residents in parts of 11 counties from west of Colorado Springs to east of Denver. It will use its funds to procure power purchase agreements for approximately 550 megawatts of wind, solar, and battery storage. Quote, "It will also allow CORE to invest in energy reliability through roughly 100 megawatts of energy storage," end quote, Pam Browerstein, the cooperative's CEO, said in a statement. United Power, which serves about 300,000 people in an area from Commerce City through Adams and Weld counties, will use the funding to offset the cost of the transition to a clean energy portfolio, including power purchase agreements for more than 760 megawatts of renewable resources. United Power has already more than 300 megawatts of renewable energy from solar, hydropower, and wind. An additional 460 megawatts of solar generation, anticipated to be online by 2030, includes 160 megawatts from a member's agrivoltaics solar project. The projects will account for an estimated reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of more than 2.1 million tons annually. Quote, "These funds are the perfect complement to the strategies United Power adopted to advance our clean energy journey," end quote, Mark Gabriel, United's CEO, said in a statement. By Mark Jaffe. In Colorado Sun news, Dana Caulfield becomes editor of the Colorado Sun as news site marks its 6th anniversary. Caulfield is succeeding Larry Reichman, who moves into a new role as publisher of the nonprofit Newsroom. By the Colorado Sun. 2 of the Colorado Sun founders are taking on new responsibilities and job titles this week as the news outlet marks its 6th anniversary. Dana Caulfield will become the editor of the Sun, succeeding Larry Reichman, who has been named publisher. The moves follow the Sun's transition to status as a 501c3 nonprofit late last year and reflect new responsibility for its senior leadership. The Sun launched in September 2018 with 10 full-time employees and today has more than 24 staffers and a large crew of talented freelance reporters and photojournalists. Caulfield, a co-founder of the Sun, has helped guide the organization since its inception, including through the conversion to nonprofit, which called on entrepreneurial skills gained in editorial direction and management at publications ranging from her family-owned North 40 News in Wellington and the Lafayette News to the startup Northern Colorado Business Report. She also was an editor at the Daily Times Call and the Rocky Mountain News and worked for 17 years as an editor on the features, business, and city desks at the Denver Post. Quote, "I'm thrilled to know that Dana is at the helm of our newsroom," end quote, Reichman said. Quote, "As any reporter or photographer can tell you, Dana brings a wealth of knowledge about our state, great skill as an editor, and warmth and humor as a friend and colleague. She will continue to be a great champion and advocate for all of our readers," end quote. Reichman, also a co-founder of The Sun, served as former senior editor at the Denver Post and its news leadership positions at the Colorado Spring Gazette and at the Greeley Tribune. He spent 22 years at the Associated Press, serving as assistant managing editor of the world's largest news-gathering organizations, a national editor in New York and reporter and editor in San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, and Carson City, Nevada. He helped cover the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of a new Russia as a Moscow correspondent in the 1990s. He also directed AP's coverage of the Columbine High School shooting, the presidential election recount in Florida in 2000, and countless other national and international news events. As publisher, Reichman will oversee all operations with a particular emphasis on the business and nonprofit fundraising efforts to support the Sun's mission. The Sun serves a statewide audience and since its founding has won numerous awards, most recently in the Colorado Press Association Journalism Contest. In May, it earned 29 awards in the 4-state Top of the Rockies contest, including 13 honors. By the Colorado Sun. In politics and government news, Colorado governor signed special session property tax bill. Conservatives remove measures from November ballot. The bipartisan measure, House Bill 1001, cuts property taxes modestly for residents and some businesses and puts limit on how fast they can grow in the future, by Brian Eason and Jesse Paul. Declaring an end to Colorado's property tax wars, for now at least, Governor Jared Polis on Wednesday signed into law a round of modest tax cuts passed during the August special legislative session to avoid the threat of far deeper cuts on the November ballot. In exchange, political groups Advance Colorado and Colorado Concern rescinded two ballot measures, Initiative 108 and 50, which would have cut taxes by $2.4 billion, put strict limits on their growth, and jeopardized the state's ability to fund K-12 schools and other public services for years to come. Quote, "This really is an example of bringing folks together who may not see eye to eye on every issue," end quote, Polis said in his office at the state capitol. Legislative Democrats and local government officials across the state hoped that the special session deal would bring an end to the years-long political tug-of-war over property taxes. Since voters repealed the tax-limiting Gallagher Amendment in 2020, taxes have climbed at historic rates due to rising home values. Those increases helped the state fully fund K-12 schools for the first time since the Great Recession, but squeezed household budgets while the state's cost of living has risen rapidly. The legislature passed a number of temporary tax cuts to mitigate their rise in recent years, but it wasn't enough to satisfy conservative groups outside the Capitol. Conservative political nonprofit Advance Colorado and Colorado Concern, a coalition of business executives, used the threat of the ballot measure to force lawmakers back to the negotiating table to pass additional tax cuts in the special session. Quote, "Today, Colorado taxpayers are the winner," end quote, Michael Fields, the president of Advance Colorado, said in a statement. Quote, "Our goal over the past 2 years has been to solve the state's property tax crisis through a significant and permanent property tax cut and an enforceable cap to prevent future tax spikes. Coloradans across the political spectrum have made it clear that they need substantial and meaningful property tax relief," end quote. In a deal negotiated with a small group of legislators before Polis called the special session, lawmakers agreed to pass additional tax cuts in exchange for Fields removing the measures from the ballot. He did so around 10 a.m., a few hours before Polis signed the bill into law. The bipartisan measure, House Bill 1001, cuts property taxes for residents and some businesses by about $255 million statewide, starting in the 2025 tax years. It also puts limits on how fast property taxes can grow in a bid to prevent large spikes like the one Coloradans experienced in the 2023 tax year for taxes paid this year. That's all the time we have for now, so we'll wrap up that article here. Thank you for joining us for the Colorado Sun. Read by Liz.
If you enjoyed this program, please register for our free services at www.aftersight.org or by calling 303-786-7777.